Welcome back to Behind the Policies, Understanding Duality in Modern Governance. I'm your host, and today we're pulling back the curtain on how policy duality actually works. In our last episode, we explored what policy duality is, that gap between what policies claim to do and what they actually accomplish. But how exactly do elites manage to shape policies to their advantage? What are the specific mechanisms they use to ensure their interests are served, even when policies are presented as benefiting everyone? Today, we're going to dissect these mechanisms, examine the evidence, and give you tools to spot them in the wild. So settle in as we explore the machinery behind policy influence, where the levers of power are located and whose hands are on them. Let's start with perhaps the most fundamental mechanism of elite influence: disproportionate access. At its core, this is about who gets a seat at the table when policies are being designed and implemented. Elites leverage their superior social, political, and economic status to gain privileged access to decision-makers through both formal and informal channels. Think about the difference between sending a form letter to your representative versus having their personal cell phone number. Or the difference between submitting a public comment on a proposed regulation versus having a private dinner with the agency head. These aren't just differences in degree. They represent fundamentally different levels of influence over how policies take shape. This access advantage manifests through several specific pathways. There's the revolving door phenomenon, where individuals move between industry positions and government roles, bringing their networks and perspectives with them. There are advisory boards and committees, which often overrepresent industry and underrepresent public interest groups or affected communities. There are industry conferences and events where informal relationships develop between regulators and the regulated. And there are campaign finance dynamics, where large donors gain access that small donors or non-donors simply don't have. Each pathway creates opportunities for elites to shape policy discussions before they even become public. The second key mechanism is what researchers call resource appropriation, the process by which public resources intended for community benefit are disproportionately captured by dominant groups. This goes beyond just having influence over policy design. It's about who actually receives the benefits once policies are implemented. And the numbers are striking. Studies show that in some regions, over 43% of benefits from public expenditures accrued to elite classes, while only 9.2% reached the most vulnerable populations. That's not a small disparity. It represents a fundamental redistribution of public resources upward rather than downward. This appropriation happens through various policy design features that might seem neutral on the surface, but produce predictably unequal outcomes. Consider tax expenditures, deductions, credits, and exemptions that reduce tax liability. While framed as available to all who qualify, benefits for homeownership, retirement savings, or education disproportionately flow to higher-income households who can afford to engage in these activities in the first place. Or think about matching requirements in grant programs, where receiving funds requires having resources to match, automatically excluding resource-poor communities. Or application processes that demand sophisticated knowledge, time, and paperwork navigation skills that are unequally distributed across society. Resource appropriation also happens through what we might call trickle-up economics, where policies ostensibly designed to help lower-income groups ultimately deliver their largest benefits elsewhere. Housing vouchers that increase landlord profits without addressing supply constraints. Education funding that gets captured by administrative growth rather than classroom resources. Infrastructure projects where contracts go to large corporations rather than local businesses. In each case, the policy appears to target community needs, but the financial flows tell a different story about who's really benefiting. It's like a game of chess where the elites are the players, and the public are the pawns. Guess who's winning? Our third mechanism requires a deeper look at the intellectual infrastructure of policymaking. Think tank influence. Far from being neutral research organizations, many think tanks function as sophisticated advocacy operations designed to shape policy discourse in ways that align with their funders' interests. Research reveals that conservative and industry-linked think tanks demonstrate greater ability to build network coalitions and have been particularly successful in global discourse creation processes favoring elite interests. They do this not just by producing reports and recommendations, but by creating entire conceptual frameworks that define how we understand policy problems and solutions. The influence of think tanks extends through multiple channels. They produce reports that lawmakers cite as independent research. They provide expert testimony in legislative hearings. They place op-eds in major media outlets. They train and supply staff for government positions. And increasingly, they cultivate direct public influence through sophisticated social media strategies. These activities create an echo chamber where certain ideas appear to have broad support and scientific backing, even when they primarily serve specific interests. The veneer of academic rigor and objectivity makes their advocacy far more effective than traditional lobbying. It's not just asking for what you want. It's establishing that what you want is objectively good policy. This think tank ecosystem operates with striking asymmetry. Well-funded think tanks supporting corporate or wealthy interests can maintain larger staffs, produce more content, and maintain more extensive networks than their public interest counterparts. In the US alone, industry-aligned think tanks outspend public interest think tanks by orders of magnitude in some policy domains. This funding differential creates an uneven playing field in the competition of ideas, not because industry-friendly ideas are inherently better, but because they have more resources behind their promotion and dissemination. The result is a policy discourse that appears balanced on the surface, but is heavily tilted beneath. The fourth mechanism, lobbying and regulatory capture, is perhaps the most visible form of elite influence, but its full scope and impact is often underappreciated. Lobbying isn't just about campaign contributions. It's a sophisticated influence operation where elites work closely with legislators and regulators to secure special privileges, predominantly through tax breaks and weaker regulation, in exchange for financial support. In the US alone, corporations spend billions annually on lobbying, and they wouldn't do so if it didn't yield returns. Research consistently shows that lobbying expenditures produce some of the highest ROIs of any corporate spending, with some estimates suggesting returns of 22,000% or more on tax-related lobbying. Regulatory capture takes this influence a step further, occurring when regulatory agencies become dominated by the industries they're charged with regulating. This happens through various pathways: the revolving door between industry and regulatory positions, information asymmetry, where agencies depend on industry for technical expertise, cultural capture, where regulators internalize industry perspectives, and resource disparities, where well-funded industry groups can overwhelm underfunded agencies. The result is regulation that appears to serve public interests while actually accommodating industry preferences, allowing companies to shape the very rules designed to constrain their behavior. What makes this mechanism especially powerful is its cumulative effect over time. A single lobbying victory or captured regulation might have limited impact, but years of systematic influence create a governance landscape thoroughly shaped by elite preferences. Tax codes become increasingly complex with carve-outs and special provisions. Regulatory frameworks become riddled with loopholes and exemptions. Enforcement becomes selective and predictable. When we wonder why some problems seem perpetually unsolved despite public demand for action, whether it's climate change, inequality, or corporate accountability, lobbying and regulatory capture are often central to the explanation. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed by those who shaped it. Beyond these structural mechanisms lies a critical psychological dimension of elite influence: narrative control. This is about shaping how policies are discussed and understood by the public, the stories we tell about what policies do and who they benefit. Research on the narrative policy framework highlights how stories with settings, characters, plots, and morals are used to frame policies in ways that align with elite interests or institutional agendas. These narratives aren't just window dressing. They're fundamental to how policies gain legitimacy and support, even when their actual impacts primarily benefit narrow interests. 3 narrative strategies are particularly effective in masking policy duality. First, hero-villain framing, where policymakers cast themselves as heroes and dissenters, as obstructionists or extremists, as seen in COVID-19 compliance campaigns that framed questioning as irresponsible rather than legitimate scrutiny. Second, universalist narratives, where policies are described as benefiting everyone equally even when benefits are highly concentrated. A rising tide lifts all boats, rhetoric for policies that mostly lift yachts. And third, crisis exploitation, where emergencies are used to justify rapid policy implementation with minimal scrutiny. We must act now pressure that bypasses normal deliberative processes. Social media has dramatically amplified these narrative control mechanisms. A 2022 study found that persuasive texts exhibit richer narrative content across key components, suggesting that the profound human need to connect and the absence of supportive connections in certain social media communications amplify the persuasive potency of strategies addressing this need. In other words, well-crafted narratives about policy impacts can override actual evidence about those impacts, especially in digital environments optimized for emotional engagement rather than critical analysis. When combined with sophisticated targeting and repetition, these narratives can create widespread public support for policies that primarily serve elite interests, not through deception per se, but through selective emphasis and framing. What makes these mechanisms truly powerful is how they work together, creating feedback loops and network effects that magnify elite influence. Access leads to resource appropriation, which generates funds for think tanks and lobbying, which secure more access, and so on. These aren't isolated tactics, but components of an interconnected system where advantages compound over time. This coordination isn't necessarily conspiratorial. It doesn't require explicit collusion or central planning. Instead, it emerges from shared interests, overlapping networks, and parallel strategies among groups with similar goals and resources. We can see this coordination at work in policy domains like financial regulation, where industry groups maintain consistent messaging across multiple channels simultaneously. Trade associations publish position papers. Think tanks release supporting research. Media outlets run favorable commentary. Lobbyists meet with legislators. Campaign contributions flow to key committee members. While each actor operates independently, their efforts align to create overwhelming pressure toward industry-friendly outcomes. The coordination extends beyond just messaging to timing, pushing initiatives during periods of low public attention or alongside distracting events, sequencing advocacy to build momentum, and maintaining pressure through personnel changes. This coordination produces policy outcomes that would be impossible through any single mechanism alone. Consider tax reform efforts that simultaneously involve think tank frameworks, media narratives about competitiveness, lobbying for specific provisions, campaign support for key legislators, and implementation advantages for those with access to sophisticated tax planning. No single component is determinative, but together they produce predictably skewed outcomes. What looks like multiple independent factors influencing policy is actually a networked system of influence with compounding effects. A system that gives structural advantages to those who can participate across multiple channels simultaneously. While we focused primarily on national policy contexts, these mechanisms of elite influence operate with equal or greater force at the global level. International institutions like the World Bank, IMF, WTO, and various UN bodies create policies with worldwide implications, often with even less transparency and accountability than national systems. Research on global governance reveals how multinational corporations and financial institutions exert disproportionate influence through technical assistance, conditional lending, trade agreements, and other instruments that shape policy options available to individual nations, especially those with limited economic or political power. This global dimension creates additional layers of policy duality. Decisions presented as technical economic management or development assistance often embed specific ideological frameworks and benefit particular interests. Structural adjustment programs, for instance, have been framed as necessary reforms for economic stability while imposing austerity measures that disproportionately impact vulnerable populations. Trade agreements described as promoting general prosperity have included intellectual property provisions that primarily benefit pharmaceutical and technology companies from wealthy nations. Climate finance mechanisms, ostensibly designed for global benefit, have often privileged certain kinds of projects and beneficiaries over others. What makes global policy duality particularly significant is how it constrains national policy options. When international agreements, loan conditions, or trade rules limit what domestic policies are permissible, they effectively remove certain choices from democratic consideration, regardless of citizen preferences. This creates a form of policy laundering, where unpopular policies difficult to pass through domestic processes are instead imposed through international obligations. The result is a further distancing between policy outcomes and democratic accountability, with additional layers of complexity that make it harder for citizens to identify the sources of policies affecting their lives and livelihoods. Now that we've explored these mechanisms, how can we identify them in practice? What specific signs or patterns should we look for to recognize when policies are being shaped by elite influence rather than public interest? One key indicator is policy complexity without clear public benefit. When laws or regulations become extraordinarily complex, running hundreds or thousands of pages with technical provisions and exceptions to exceptions, it's often a sign that concentrated interests have been inserting advantageous language. Complexity serves as a smokescreen, making it difficult for journalists, watchdogs, or citizens to identify who benefits. Ask yourself, does this policy need to be this complicated to achieve its stated goal? If not, who benefits from the complexity? Another telling sign is the disconnect between policy justifications and resource allocations. Pay attention to the gap between the problems highlighted in policy announcements and where the money actually goes. If a policy is framed around helping small businesses but directs most resources to large corporations, that's a clear indicator of duality at work. Similarly, watch for policies that claim to address systemic issues but focus funding on band-aid solutions. Homelessness initiatives that fund temporary shelters rather than affordable housing. Education reforms that pay for testing rather than reducing class sizes, or environmental policies that subsidize minor efficiency improvements rather than structural changes. Perhaps most importantly, pay attention to who's allowed to participate meaningfully in policy development. When advisory committees are dominated by industry representatives, when public comment periods are short or poorly publicized, when technical language creates barriers to participation, when meetings occur during work hours without virtual options. These are all signs that access is being limited to those already possessing resources and influence. Genuine inclusion in policy processes looks markedly different. Diverse stakeholder representation, multiple channels for input, resources to support participation by affected communities, and transparent incorporation of public feedback. The absence of these features suggests the policy may be serving interests other than those publicly stated. As we conclude our exploration of elite influence mechanisms, 3 key insights stand out. First, these mechanisms don't operate in isolation, but function as an interconnected system, reinforcing and amplifying each other. Disproportionate access enables resource appropriation. Think tanks provide intellectual cover for lobbying efforts. Narrative control makes it harder to recognize regulatory capture. Understanding this interconnectedness is crucial because it means addressing any single mechanism in isolation is unlikely to fundamentally change outcomes. Effective reform requires addressing multiple leverage points simultaneously, challenging the entire ecology of influence rather than just its individual components. Second, these mechanisms operate largely through legal and accepted channels, making them difficult to challenge through traditional accountability measures. They represent not corruption in the conventional sense of breaking rules, but rather the capture of the rule-making process itself. This is why simply enforcing existing laws or electing new officials often proves insufficient. The system is functioning as designed, just not as publicly portrayed. Addressing these dynamics requires not just detecting violations of rules, but questioning whether the rules themselves have been captured. It means looking beyond corruption, framing to examine how legitimate processes can produce persistently skewed outcomes. Finally, recognizing these mechanisms in action is the first step toward reducing their impact. While elite influence is powerful, it's not inevitable or unchangeable. Transparency initiatives can reveal who's meeting with decision makers. Participation requirements can ensure diverse voices in policy development. Independent analysis can highlight distributional impacts before implementation. Media literacy can help citizens recognize persuasive narratives. And collective action can create countervailing power to balance elite influence. By understanding how these mechanisms work, we gain the knowledge needed to build more equitable governance systems, ones where policies more truly serve their publicly stated purposes rather than hidden agendas. Thank you for joining me for this second episode of Behind the Policies, Understanding Duality in Modern Governance. In our next episode, we'll explore how technology both enables and potentially counters elite influence in policymaking. We'll examine how social media shapes policy support, how think tanks leverage digital platforms, how AI governance is being influenced by powerful interests, and how surveillance creates new forms of policy duality. We'll also consider how technology might be harnessed to create more transparent, participatory, and equitable governance systems. Until then, I encourage you to watch for these mechanisms in your daily news consumption. When you hear about a new policy initiative, ask yourself, who had access to shape it? Who's likely to appropriate its resources? Which think tanks are promoting it? Has regulatory capture played a role? And what narrative is being used to sell it? The answers might reveal the hidden machinery of influence at work in our governance systems.